All right, third time is the charm. I'm sure of that. Okay, good evening to you all, and welcome officially to the first installment of Sonnambula's 2021 programming in Music's Time. My name is Elizabeth Weinfield, and I'm the Artistic Director of Sonnambula. And on behalf of my colleagues in the ensemble, Amy Dominguez, Thomas Iliev, James Kennerly, and Jude Ziliak, it's my pleasure to introduce you to this lecture and conversation series, which seeks to illuminate special moments in music history through interdisciplinary exchange. Now, I know we'd all much rather be together in person right now, but wherever you are, I hope very much that you're safe and well. And I take comfort in knowing that if all goes well, we're very likely to be in person soon, reunited, performing for you again soon. But meanwhile, we're so thankful to be able to connect with you all in this forum. That said, we want to hear from you. So please say hello during the session in the chat bar. Let us know that you're here, where you're logging in from. And if you have a question during the session, please post the question there as well. The chat bar will be monitored by our administrator throughout the hour. And you can also email questions to sonnambulaviles@gmail.com, and we will address them at the end of the session. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our inaugural guest today, our colleague and dear friend, Dr. Adam Eaker. Adam Eaker is Assistant Curator of Northern Baroque and British Painting in the Department of European Paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he served as curator of a show that I know many of us have seen, In Praise of Painting, Dutch Masterpieces at the Met. He's also the co-curator of the Met's upcoming show, Art at the Tudor Courts, which was supposed to open this fall, but due to COVID will now open in October of 2022. Fortunately, that was not canceled, just postponed. We're very happy about that. Adam's also curated at the Frick. As the Anne L. Poulet Curatorial Fellow, he co-curated the show Van Dyck, The Anatomy of Portraiture in 2016. He holds a BA honors in art history from Yale and a PhD in art history from Columbia. He is published in numerous publications such as the Metropolitan Museum Journal, Art History, Historians of Netherlandish Art Reviews, and the Art Bulletin, to name a few. And he is lecturer in art history at Barnard College. So Adam, welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's an honor to be here as a longtime fan of Sonnambula and the performances that you've done at the Met. I'm delighted that we can have this conversation, even though unfortunately we can't all be in a concert hall or a lecture hall together. So thank you so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure. Now, we met years ago at the Met. Sonnambula has put together at this point quite a few concerts for the museum, for various events, various shows. How long have you been at the museum? And I know some art historians go strictly into academia, but what made you take the museum route?
So I've been at the Met for 5 years in March. I'm told you're considered new at the Met for 10 years. It's kind of like New York in that way. It takes 10 years to become really situated. So I'm halfway there. And as you mentioned, I had a fellowship at the Frick, really wonderful curatorial training grounds before I came to the Met. And that was one of any number of art history fellowships that I applied for. I was writing a dissertation and living in Belgium. I wanted to come back to the US, and I was very lucky that I got this opportunity to curate a show. At that point, I was really anticipating an academic career, but was excited to learn more about curation. And I loved it pretty much from day one, and had wonderful mentors both at the Frick and the Met who encouraged me to follow that track. So that's how I ended up where I am now. I still do academic teaching and publishing, but I love working hands-on with the objects and the exhibitions.
Right. Actually, my next question is going to be about the materiality in your job. I mean, curator essentially means, or to curate, I should say, means to care for objects. Mm-hmm. So how do you care for your objects? And to that end, can you describe a typical day at work? It may be pre-pandemic first, but then so many of us who perform music are having to sort of reinvent what we're doing right now. How has COVID also impacted your work at the museum right now?
To answer the first part of your question about taking care of the objects, I should say I'm not a conservator, so I don't physically take care of or intervene in the objects, although I work very closely with our wonderful conservation department at the Met. But what I do is make sure that the objects are researched, that they're accessible, that we tell interesting and exciting stories with them so that a new generation can fall in love with this wonderful collection that we have. One of my favorite parts of my job, and something that I do in close collaboration with the conservation team, is to go into storage. We have many more paintings in storage than we can possibly display, and some of them are really sleeping beauties, just wonderful objects with fascinating stories to tell that maybe just need to have a discolored varnish removed, and they can go on view and really become a new treasure of the Met without us having to go out and make a new acquisition. I found that in the exhibition of our permanent collection that I curated in praise of painting, one of the real stars of the show has been a still life by an artist named Margareta Habermann. And that was a painting that the Met actually acquired in 1871, 1 year after we were founded. But it was that hadn't been on view for a long time. I think the fact that it was by a woman artist for many generations of curators was not especially interesting. I think for a contemporary audience, that's very interesting. And it's also just a completely remarkable and exquisite work of art. And that's something that we saw more and more once it had had a proper cleaning in the conservation studio.
That's interesting. I mean, speaking of that exhibition, that Dutch Masterpieces exhibition, which is quite extensive and which features, I think every work in that exhibition is a Met work. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, it's a show strictly drawn from our permanent collection. But one thing that was exciting about it is we have received Dutch paintings through numerous means, including many bequests. And some of those bequests are quite restrictive, where the paintings are meant to hang as a group. So everything that came with the Lehman bequest hangs in the Lehman wing. Same with the Linsky pictures. But because this is a temporary exhibition, we're allowed to place those paintings in dialogue with one another in a way that people hadn't seen before. And I've been really struck by the number of visitors to the museum, even regular Met members, who have asked me how many of the paintings are loans because they haven't seen them before. They're not used to seeing them in this conversation.
So I remember walking through this exhibition myself right before New York City was shut down. And so many of the sitters in these paintings, and I think we can say that this collection is really a representative swath of sort of Dutch early modern paintings. So many of the sitters in these paintings are women, and also they're women that are engaged in music in some way. Women playing music, women studying music, women reading music, performing together, practicing together, taking lessons. And when I look through this collection, I can't help, of course, but to think of Leonora Duarte, who was writing music right in the middle of the 17th century in Antwerp, probably, let's say, the 1630s through 1660s. In other words, precisely when so many of the works in your collection were made. And I've been doing some work lately, as you know, on Duarte's friendships, or let's say her plausible intellectual interlocutors, her companionships. And there are two letters to Duarte that exist from the natural philosopher and writer Margaret Cavendish. One letter extols Duarte's abilities as a musician, and the other one is essentially a lengthy exegesis on alchemy, which I'd like to ask you a little bit about later. But both of these letters recall what are probably specific evenings that these two women spent together in Antwerp, clearly deeply engaged with one another. And they reveal the makings of an authentic intellectual companionship, and they show mutual admiration, sincere affection, and they indicate that Duarte, about whom we know very little, was a plausible and a very probable intellectual equal to Margaret Cavendish, about whom we know, let's say, maybe a little bit more. And this is important because it brings Duarte, one of history's, as it were, silenced voices, into the realm of science and into the realm of letters and true intellectual society. And so getting back to these pictures, I want to ask, as we look at all of these images of women making music together from the 17th century, what can we glean about women's relationships with one another, if anything at all?
That's a great question. And I did bring a few images to share. So I will pull those up. A lot of the images that we have, both in the Met's collection and in general, depict solitary music making. And the reason behind that is not so much that women were always making music alone in real life, but the idea is that these are paintings that address an imaginary male beholder, kind of as invitations to a duet. And very often, as in these two examples by van der Helst on the left and Vermeer on the right, you have the inclusion of a second instrument. So there's a viol lying in the foreground of both of these paintings. A little hard to see in the Vermeer here. And the idea is that a man is being invited to pick up this instrument and to accompany this woman on the lute. And in fact, in the van der Helst, which has just been cleaned, you actually have scores for tenor and soprano voices next to the instruments. So there is this anticipation of the duet. Of course, in reality, music was much more of a social practice. So we have an image of a father and daughter here on the left. The father is pulling out his lute, maybe to instruct his daughter. On the right, we have this mezzo scene of a merry company making music together. So music really is a social practice, very often eroticized in painting and in literature, but probably in real life was much more about a kind of general sociability where women like Leonora Duarte and Margaret Cavendish might encounter one another. And certainly we know that for women of the upper classes, the upper bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, music making was one of a number of accomplishments with which a woman could advertise herself on the marriage market. She might become more socially mobile. She would attract certain forms of patronage and favor through not only making music, but also being a gifted calligrapher. There were women who were famous for incising calligraphic inscriptions into glass vessels that they could make gifts of. So there are all sorts of practices of accomplishment that we wouldn't think of as professional music making or professional painting, but that had their own distinct social rewards.
I'd like to go back to the idea of museum curatorship in how it relates to music for a moment, if I might. The museum is an institution that I think most people most strongly associate with the term curator. However, curator, as we touched on earlier, is a concept that It means to care, to organize, but it's infiltrated the music world lately. Individuals who might have in the past been referred to as producers or as concert organizers are now, in some cases, hailed as concert curators or music curators. And we can certainly make the argument that the term in some ways is overused. For example, do I really need my local drugstore to curate a regime of headache convalescence for me? Although I have to say that does sound, nice on some days. But there's also a case to be made for proper application of that term in music, considering the fact that the history of the museum is rooted in the Kunstkammer in the early modern world, or the collector's cabinet, rooms filled with curiosities and paintings and music, instruments, sheet music and otherwise. Music is so often a part of the business of collecting and display in the early modern world. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And these Kunstkammern that you mentioned were spaces of sociability, spaces of encounter, performance. Certainly music played a part in that. And I think to the extent that we use the verb to curate in the sense of to carefully select, to apply one's knowledge of a given body of material and distill it down to a representative selection, I think it's totally appropriate to the work of a presenter of a concert series, for example. And I know people often lament the museumification of classical music, that the focus is so much on historic art as opposed to contemporary classical compositions. I'm a historian. I love historical material. I love early music, so I don't have a particular problem with that. But I think that this idea of the presenter as curator may go hand in hand with this sense that we're looking to widen our historic repertoire, maybe because we're more interested in that historic material than in the contemporary sometimes. Although you could certainly be a contemporary art or music curator.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to hear, it's interesting to hear that articulated in that way. In Antwerp, in early modern Antwerp, the owners of Kunstkammern, which is where Duarte grew up and where she worked and where she wrote her Seven Sinfonia, were largely merchants, and many of them, like the Duarte family, were conversos, or Jews that had converted to, or had, either by choice or by force, converted to Catholicism in the wake of the Inquisition. And the Duarte Kunstkammer and art collection was arguably a testament both to the family's investment, on the one hand, in empirical observation, and the kinds of connections between observation and status that are particularly encouraged by this kind of semi-public space. There is a tradition, as you know, in 17th century Antwerp of paintings of Kunstkammern. And I'll just share a couple here right now. And so I brought a few. I wonder if you could sort of tell us what's going on in a few of these pictures.
Sure. This is really one of the signature genres of 17th century Antwerp painting. This was a city that was a major entrepot, a place where art from all over Europe and from beyond Europe was traded. It's the city where Durer sees Aztec artifacts for the first time. So really a globalized center of the art trade. And these images commemorate that. They commemorate the fantastic collections that existed in the city. At the same time, these aren't documentary images. When we look at inventories, we know that pictures were spread throughout the house, probably not hung floor to ceiling like this. And certainly Antwerp houses didn't have ceilings this high. So these are idealized, imaginary images of collecting that nonetheless might reproduce real pictures, very often do in fact reproduce identifiable paintings that still exist today. And as you can see from the range of objects, these weren't just collections of painting, but also of classical sculpture, reproductions of classical sculpture. They might contain curiosities, foreign objects, proto-scientific types of collections. So really they were about condensing a kind of universality into the space of a collection. That seems to have been one of the guiding principles.
Is it true that the paintings can be identified in most of these scenes? How are they used? If they're not used kind of diagrammatically in art history, how are these kinds of pictures used? Are they used out? Are they discussed as allegories or?
Certainly allegory is one critical reading of these, and you have a series, for example, that Jan Bruegel the Elder collaborated on with Rubens, where each painting is an allegory of one of the senses. So they might use art in the background that contributes to that subject matter, and in the picture depicting the sense of smell, you have wonderful arrangements of flowers gathered together, to cite just one example. At the same time, another influential argument about these paintings is that they propose a kind of canon of art. So this is a moment when Antwerp, which is really declining as a commercial center in the midst of warfare and Spanish occupation, is increasingly invested in its own cultural history. So it's beginning to articulate a canon, beginning with perhaps the artist Quentin Metsais at the start of the 16th century, the idea that there's an Antwerp school and writers are collecting the biographies of the great painters of the Antwerp school, and painters are reproducing them in these imaginary collections. So that's one idea. You also have the phenomenon in Antwerp of the collaborative painting, which is not just a workshop production where the master recruits his apprentices to finish unimportant parts of the painting. This is a painting where masters of equal stature collaborate with their own specialties. And so you might even have an image of a collection where artists are painting miniaturized versions of their own work. So they become real conversation pieces, tests for connoisseurs. We can imagine the kind of conversation you're meant to have in front of these paintings as you pick out different hands, as you demonstrate your own sophistication and expertise as a connoisseur and collector.
I see. I think so often in musicology, when we use paintings in musicology to illustrate a principle or an idea, there is this sort of default action to use the painting diagrammatically, to use it as fact without sort of uncovering the iconological layers and which hold alternate meaning. And that said, considering the Duarte family is in Antwerp and that this genre is born in that city, when I look at this picture, which is Gonzalez Cox from the 1650s, a portrait of the Duarte family, and here's Leonora right in the center, I can't help but to see some kind of similarity here in the way that these people are being showcased for their musical abilities. And because Duarte was playing and singing and making music, as well as with her sisters and at least one brother, she's part of this kind of business environment that's filled with certain kinds of transactions, economic transactions, but also social transactions, ethnic, linguistic, and so forth. And she becomes part of, if even just, sheerly formally here, this culture of advertisement. So I've been reading this picture as a kind of musical offering, so to speak, advertising her prodigiousness. What do you make of this picture, given what you've just told us about the other paintings?
Well, one thing that we know about imagery of music making in the 17th century is that there was a great deal of investment on the part of moralizing writers in the idea of what we might now think of as the happy nuclear family. And And one of the key metaphors that they used for that was concord or harmony. So the idea of an instrument that has multiple strings, but that they are all in tune with one another, that was a very common metaphor for the harmonious, well-functioning family. And so when you show this family gathered together, able to make music with each other, that is, I read, an image of their supposed harmony, as well as the fact that these children have had an expensive education. Musical instruments, for the most part, were luxury goods. Lutes and viols were generally imported from Italy or the German-speaking lands. They weren't something generally manufactured in the Low Countries during this period. So they themselves are luxury objects, collectibles that are being displayed here. But it's also the skill, the acumen, and the ability to play together, as I said, in harmony that the artist is exhibiting.
This idea of harmony, or in the words of Francis Bacon, universal sympathy, brings up really this connection that I think we've touched on a little bit already between music and alchemy, which is so clearly underscored by this concept of universal sympathy. And to illustrate it, Bacon uses actually the metaphor between two string instruments to allude to the power of music to affect or to actually move the emotions. And it makes me think about painters who are sort of mixing paint, mixing colors, creating something from nothing. How is alchemy implicated in discussions of painting at this time? And I ask this now because I want to bring up a point in Duarte's music, which may also serve in this conversation.
This specialized technical knowledge that you bring up that painters had of pigments was highly sought after in the period, when there isn't yet, or is only just emerging, a division between the natural sciences, alchemy, and the pigment trade. So many of the pigments that an artist might use to make a painting might also be believed to have medical applications. Apothecaries might be pigment dealers. So there's a lot of overlap among the different professional and social groups who are interested in different pigments, in different mineral practices. And we do have recorded dialogues. There's a wonderful manuscript kept by a doctor to the English court, long serving over multiple reigns in the 17th century. And we know that he would seek out the expertise of Van Dyck, for example, to talk about the effects of pigments, to discuss their application. And we also know that women participated in these dialogues. One of the artists who I've done a lot of work on is a woman named Mary Beale, who worked in London, had a studio there in the second half of the 17th century. And her husband was actually what's called a color man, a pigment dealer. And one of the ways that she secured her training was he would give pigments for free to more established artists who would allow her to observe them at work. So there are all sorts of exchanges, both of technical knowledge and expertise, but also of the physical material of pigment that facilitate these conversations across social and professional groups.
I mentioned earlier that one of the letters to Duarte from Cavendish involves a discussion of alchemy. Cavendish is claiming that Duarte is practicing alchemy, and she spends a very long time telling us that gold cannot actually be made from stone. And whether or not Duarte here as recipient is a foil for this missive is unclear, but we do know that also many musicians in the 17th century were known to have also been very closely associated with alchemy, or known to have experimented with alchemy. Monteverdi, for one, was publicly known for his seriousness about alchemy, and it comes forward in a number of Monteverdi's letters. And he's famously addressed after his death in a sonnet with the epithet "In morte di Claudio Monteverdi, gran professor della chimica." And there's something of the alchemical, I want to say, in some of Duarte's music, particularly with the way that certain harmonic areas are approached, and she seems to sort of conjure up emotion out of nothing. I wonder, actually, maybe we could play an example of this. This is Duarte's Sinfonia number 4.
Beautiful.
Thank you. We have a question actually in the chat from Barbara Hanning for Adam. She asks, who is the figure in the Duarte family group who looks like a friar?
I believe that is one of the sons in the family who was a friar. But Elizabeth, I think you've studied that painting more than I have. That's, I should say, not a picture in the Met's collection. It's a picture in Budapest. But I'm pretty sure that one of the sons, as was very common in Catholic families in Antwerp, became a friar and is depicted here.
As far as I understand, there are two sons, Gaspar II and Diego II. I didn't know that, so that's very interesting. I've always sort of thought of this as a symbol for their devout Catholicism. There's no question that they are practicing Judaism here. God forbid, we even have a friar in our family portrait.
Yeah, my guess is that this is a portrait of an individual. And that's quite common that almost every family who had multiple surviving children would have nuns or monks or priests in the family in this period. And the male ecclesiastics would very often be pictured in a family group. Again, it's a kind of form of social advertisement of piety. And that's what I've always assumed is happening there. But you've done more research on the family than I have.
I mean, it's very interesting, and I didn't remember about that detail about one of the sons. We have another question in the chat from a listener who asks, where did artists get their materials at this time, and who paid for them? Would they receive payments from patrons like the sitters we saw today? Did artists share recipe books for mixing pigments?
That's a great question. The 17th century is before the emergence of pre-mixed, stable commercial paints. So every artist is mixing his own paints, a very laborious process. I've actually gotten to do it in the 17th century way. It's a lot of work. A great reason to have apprentices on hand. Most painters would have to acquire their own materials. In the 17th century, you have artists largely painting on spec, operating on a pretty modernized art market, at least in Antwerp and Amsterdam. And so they are having to have a certain outlay of cash. That said, we know that pigments could be given as a gift. There's actually a really intriguing record of Charles I, King of England, making a gift of ultramarine, one of the most expensive pigments imported from Afghanistan, that he made a gift of ultramarine both to Van Dyck, his court painter, and also to an artist named Joan Carlyle, a woman painter, someone whose practice really straddles what we would think of amateur and professional practices. And so it's very interesting that he's giving this very expensive pigment to these two practitioners who we normally wouldn't see in the same sentence next to each other, but they are given a certain equivalence through this gift of ultramarine from the king.
Before we move further, I want to talk about your recent acquisition at the Met, painting by the Flemish 17th century painter Clara Peters. And I have a copy of it here with me. Tell us about this work.
This has been one of the most exciting initiatives I've gotten to be involved with while at the Met. When I started working at the museum about a little under 5 years ago, I was asked by various colleagues at auction houses and galleries if I had a wish list, what I was looking to acquire, because that's a huge part of a curator's job. And I said that I wanted a still life by Clara Peters. She's a foundational figure in the history of still life painting in Northern Europe. We know almost nothing about her, but we do have a group of signed and dated paintings from a career of about 12 years. And these are really foundational, original works. For example, she's the first person we know of to paint a still life of fish, something that becomes one of the major pillars of still life painting in Europe. She's also, as you see here, exquisite floral painter. She paints what we would think of as breakfast still lifes, depicting butter, cheese. And she has all sorts of self-referential motifs in her painting. So she'll have her own self-portrait reflected in a metallic surface, or she very often includes a knife with her name inscribed down the handle. This was a common bridal gift in Antwerp. So she's a really fascinating artist. She has a surviving oeuvre of fewer than 40 paintings, so about the same number of paintings we have for Vermeer. Very rare, most of them already in museums. So I wasn't too hopeful that we would be able to find one in the condition and of the quality that would make it really a Met picture. But about, I guess, 2 years ago now, I was approached by a colleague in the art world who knew of a painting that was available. This was a picture that was in the literature on the artist on the basis of a black and white 1932 photograph. So not a picture that had been known to survive, or no one had laid eyes on it. And it took a lot of research to reconstruct. We needed to know where it had been and that kind of thing. And then we had to raise the money. Still life is among the most expensive types of painting for us to acquire, because it's secular, it's appealing, it's the sort of thing you can put in your Hamptons house. So we have a lot of competition when we want to acquire this kind of thing. But fortunately, the consignor was very patient with us, and we found very generous donors. So we were ultimately able to acquire this picture in January, just a couple months before COVID hit. And our galleries are in the process of being reinstalled. They actually reopen next week. So you will be able to come and see her work. And totally fortuitously, we also received a bequest this year of wonderful Italian still life paintings. And these include two works by an artist named Ursula Maddalena Caccia, who was a nun. I think she eventually became an abbess in northern Italy. And one of the ways that she supported her convent was as a still life painter. So we're now able to have a kind of transalpine conversation among women still life painters of the 17th century that I'm really excited to present to the public next week.
It's fantastic. And so we can all go and see this picture in person. It's wonderful. We have a question from a colleague of mine at Juilliard, Greta Berman, who teaches art history at Juilliard. She asks, do you, Adam, think that Valère Koster was aware of Clara Peters?
That's a really interesting question. Valère Koster, whom the question refers to, is a wonderful 18th century French still life painter. She certainly would have been immersed in 17th century Dutch and Flemish still life. She probably wouldn't have known the name of Clara Peters. One of the iniquities of history is we know Clara Peters was collected very early on by, for example, the Spanish royal collection already by the 1640s. Her works have entered, are in the Prado today. But the inventories at the time didn't even record her name. We can only identify those pictures because their subject matter is closely described. We can track inventory numbers. They were signed paintings, so her name could have been recorded, but she's not someone who is the subject of early biographies, celebratory poems. She really is a very shadowy figure in the archival record. And my assumption would be that by the 18th century in France, there would have been no awareness of her name or her biography, even though her works might have been in very prestigious collections.
It's true what you're saying about the fact that there's just frankly not much archival evidence about Peters, and this is true about so many voices in the past, particularly women. And yet it's not impossible, though, to assemble a nexus of information around someone like Peters. Musicology has certainly for a while now legitimized the sociocultural moment, for example, the social history, let's say, in which the composer was writing as a crucial component to our intellectual consumption of the work, and thus expanding the concept of the work. Does art history operate in this way? How do we construct a picture of her whereabouts from what little we have of her?
Well, there have been amazing strides even in the past 5 years, I would say. One misfortune that Clara Peters had is she has a very common name. So there are many women named Clara Peters in the archives of the Low Countries. And for a long time, there was an unfortunate tendency to assume that they were all the painter. And so suddenly people said she was a prodigy. She was painting incredible works at the age of 8 years old. There was another longtime assumption that she was an Amsterdam prostitute. So there have been a lot of red herrings in the attempt to reconstruct her life. But there is a Flemish researcher named Jean Bastiensen who published a very persuasive article in the Prado Bulletin offering a hypothesis based on his archival research for which Clara Peters, the painter, actually was. It's not a hugely detailed account yet, but we now have a rough sense of her birth and death dates. One of the great mysteries with her is that we assume she was an Antwerp painter because the panels she painted on bear Antwerp marks. So when you were a panel manufacturer, you put a mark into the wood, identifying the city where it was made very often. So the panels were made in Antwerp, but there were no mentions of Clara Peters in Antwerp inventories, no mention of her in the Painters Guild. But one thing that's very appealing about this new hypothesis is he argues that she was actually a woman named Clara Lamberts from the city of Mechelen in Flanders, who married an Antwerp painter. And if you were a woman married to a member of the Antwerp Painters Guild, you were never registered independently. You didn't have to have your own guild membership, which some women did, but not the wives of painters. So that's cleared up one mystery for us. And we have further bits of evidence, not from archival sources, but from the paintings themselves. So we have Antwerp marks on the panels. We have this bridal knife that appears over and over again, which was probably an object she actually owned and which tells us that she was a married woman. We also have her disguised self-portraits, which give us a very tantalizing, very shadowy sense of her appearance. So these are little bits and pieces that we can use to stitch together a picture and a biography for her.
It's fascinating. And we have another question from the chat bar, which I think will continue this line of inquiry. A listener writes, given the mix of arts, music, the sciences that we see in Kunstkammer images, can we assume that painters and musicians / composers who perhaps formed part of important guilds were also in the same social groups? Do we have any written evidence of this in letters, for example? I mean, I know with Duarte, because she was Jewish or converso, but thought of as ethnically Jewish, she certainly wasn't allowed to participate in the guild system. But what about someone like Clara Peters?
We have a sense that Clara Peters came from an artistic family, that her father was a painter, her husband was a painter, if this hypothesis is true. So she is someone whose life would have been very much structured by guild organization, whether or not she herself had access to things like guild festivities. Those may have occurred in pretty exclusively male environments. But it's important to bear in mind that there's a whole other stratum of art making. And I think it's one we might associate Leonora Duarte with, but also many women artists. And that is one where art making is not a professional practice where individual paintings are being bought and sold. It's much more a social practice and takes place within a gift economy, where we have to remember, I think we often think that being a professional has a higher status than being an amateur. But that was not at all the case in the 17th century. Amateurs were people who didn't have to make art for a living. They were superior, they were gentlemen and ladies. So even some artists who really were surviving based on the patronage they received for their production would always present their work under the guise of being a gift. They would speak in very self-deprecating terms. They would claim the status of amateurs, even when they really had a kind of existential need to sell their work. So certainly there are elite circles engaging in painting, music making, calligraphy, scientific research that aren't at all what we would think of as professional and that don't really have anything to do with the world of the guild. I'll just point out also that if you were a court artist, you were exempt from guild regulation. And that's one reason why we know less about Rubens and his apprentices than we do about otherwise totally forgotten painters, because he didn't have to keep records. He didn't have to report to the guild. It was also a major source of social friction, particularly in London, where court patronage often went to foreign-born artists who were not guild members, where they really aroused a lot of hostility from a nativist, guild-regulated body of painters.
It's the Kunstkammer, to continue that question sort of from the musicological side. The Kunstkammer is really kind of important to music history for the fact that it opens up spaces for music making in which women are ultimately implicated. I mean, women who could, for whatever reason, not write for or perform in the church or the synagogue or at court, they made music at home. I mean, even prodigiously talented musicians like the Duarte, who we may call professional musicians today, and were sort of relegated to that environment in and around the Kunstkammer. It's interesting to say that there's a trend in manuscript production at this time in Antwerp to refer to the Kunstkammer in the collection. There's one collection called The Excellent Cabinet. If I have time, I'll show the frontispiece. It's a 2-volume collection of 2- and 3-part instrumental music that plays with this conceit of the art cabinet. And the title of the print is a direct, very direct reference to the Kunstkammer. And the work itself, the manuscript itself, is quite literally a collection of disparate entities that are being displayed, that are being performed. In this case, those entities are musical objects for different combinations of instruments that together reflect a sort of variety that was bound to sell well. And I think we can see elements of this observation and display in some of the music, in some of Duarte's music. For example, the Third Sinfonia, it's a 43-bar work, and it's centered around the musical idea of a falling third. There are 2 distinctly homophonic sections that occur in the center of the work and the conclusion, which divides the piece very clearly into sections. And there are these areas of repose, which are aurally separated from busier areas of free imitative counterpoint. And they sort of permit a vantage point for the performer to observe, for example, Italianate modal shifts here and English figurations here, and to anticipate what is to come. And it really seems to carry with it a sense of observation that is born of the Kunstkammer. And I'd like to play that piece, if I might. This is Duarte's Sinfonia number 3.
Fantastic.
Before we wrap up for the hour, I'd like to show a special picture. This is a painting that's in the Met under your care, Adam, and it originally hung in the Duarte home. This is a painting from the Duarte family collection. Can you tell us what's happening here? It's a music making scene.
Sure. We give it the modern title, the Serenade, not a title that comes from the 17th century. But what's striking here compared to other images we've seen is this is exterior music making. These are strolling players, and they wear these sort of fantastical Commedia dell'arte inspired costumes and masks. So there's some idea that they're going door to door, maybe soliciting donations, or perhaps they've been dispatched to play under someone's window, a kind of serenade. But it's a wonderful nocturnal scene where you have this fantastic effect of different sources of illumination, the moon, the torch held by the young boy, and it gives it a kind of mystery. This is a tiny painting, I should say, so it's really a work that only one person can look at a time, what we would call a cabinet picture. So something you're meant to pore over intimately within a small room. And at the same time, I think there is a kind of element of menace I always find, particularly in this masked figure on the far right. So I think it makes me think of other images of the carnivalesque or of merrymaking, music making happening in the streets of the early modern city as something unruly, something that could easily get out of hand. So very different from those refined, genteel images of sociability occurring within the family sphere.
Thank you very much. Since we're at time, maybe I'll just finish with one final question from the chat. This is from Paul Ross, who asks, early music historians use art to learn about period instruments and practice. Does this also work in reverse, where music illuminates art or the art history?
Great question. Very often I do find myself consulting my colleagues in the Department of Musical Instruments or my musicologist friends to ask simply, is this an accurate representation? Very often painters were not particularly knowledgeable or skilled about the instruments they were depicting. So you have paintings where the lute has too many strings or not enough strings, or the fingering shown is impossible or inaccurate. So that's always interesting to learn. But even more than that, it's wonderful to know sometimes we can identify the instruments depicted pretty closely, their area of geographic origin or the type of music that's being played. Sometimes you still have sheet music represented where we can even identify the song. So always so grateful to be able to draw on that expertise.
And indeed to be able to collaborate, and maybe we'll end there. So Adam Eaker, Assistant Curator of European Paintings at the Metropolitan Museum, thank you so much for being our first interlocutor in Music's Time. And thank you everybody for listening and tuning in lieu of a live performance in these times we're in right now. Speakers for 2021 will be announced in January. So we hope that you will log in again and join us again. And meanwhile, hope everybody is keeping well and be well. We hope to see you soon.
Take care, be safe. Bye.